Assalamualaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Good. Let me see if I can get Dr. I'm going to mute myself and then call Dr. Sub.
Okay.
Hey, Assalamualaikum, Nihal.
Alaikum salam.
Islam. I think we are a few people who are asking if you're on.
Yeah, I was sending a message. So we're on. I guess we're just waiting for everyone to join in. So
Yeah, give a couple of minutes. I'd like to also have Dr. Abdul Rahman, who's joined us. Who's
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum Assalam, Dr. Saab. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, good. How are you? You're looking great.
Thank you.
I'm joining you from Hawaii.
MashaAllah.
Of course, this is virtual Hawaii. You understand that, don't you?
I do.
Here you go. Camera on this computer of mine is not good, so please forgive all this haziness that you might see around. What can you do? Gotta deal with what you have.
I'm going to take a picture of you.
Yeah, but I'm sure
So-
it's being, you can record it on,
Yeah. Nihal will record it, inshallah.
yeah.
So, Assalamu alaikum. I'd like to at least introduce to a few people,
Oh, yeah, I see a young man, Mustafa on.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Mustafa.
Thank you for
Minai.
having me.
MashaAllah, thanks for joining, Mustafa. Dr. Mustafa Minai is lives in Princeton and he teaches Urdu. He's the, I'll let him speak. I don't want to mess up his introduction. MashaAllah, he's the
Thanks, sir.
grandson of the very famous poet from Lucknow.
Oh, mashallah.
Thank you, Ji. I'm humbled. Yes, I teach Urdu at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia.
Ah,
And yes, since Sajid Bhai brought it up, my great grandfather was a poet named Amir Minai, who lived from 1828 to 1900 and was a contemporary of Dav Dehelvi.
I see.
They were good friends, and he left behind quite a few works of his poetry and other things.
Mm-hmm.
Shukriya.
So, Dr. Abdul Rahman, I think we should start. He's basically our chair of the Rumi Circle at the Muslim Center of Greater Princeton. And if you want to start off, mashallah, I think we're, as we really have 10 people on, so let's start, inshallah.
Oh, very good. So you want me to start?
You can start off
Okay.
with
How's that? Okay, then let me just say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Every beginning is with the name of our Creator, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who has blessed us with the gift of life and has brought us to this world so that we can spread His message through the works of the people that are very close to Him and chosen by Him. MashaAllah, with a very nice beginning, seeing Mustafa Minai, because Amir Minai is my favorite poets that I learned from, besides Glory of Iqbal and, of course, Rumi. So I'm very excited that our masjid and Sajid Bhai and Zafar Bhai have started, MashaAllah, programs at the Princeton Masjid that are geared towards shaping our future community, Muslim community, and by and large, overall community where we live in, to get the message of Islam through the works of our scholars. I always say that mila hai humko aaba se jo virsa ilm o hikmat ka हमारा फर्ज है पहुंचाएं इसको अगली नस्लों तक. It's our responsibility and obligation now to pass on this beautiful resource that we have actually received from our ancestors. So it's a great thing, and I understand with brother Nihal coming now, I keep calling them brothers because I like to feel young that way. I hope they'll call me Brother Rahman too. So this way, instead of saying uncle or Babaji, I'll feel good. I remember feeling this way when Zamir Jafri Saab came to me to New York for the first time. And he looked quite old to me at the time. And I felt that I was still in my 20s, although I was probably close to 60 at the time. So he called me Rahman Bhai. So I felt so great. And then I started to call him Zamir Bhai, and that works. So we will be very informal, mashallah. And I see with Nihal Khan joining us, and I have not been introduced to him now, but the way I hear things from Zafar Bhai and Sajid, I know we are really in good company. And we will have good leadership from him. So this should be a brief opening remark from me, and I'll let you, Sajid, take over and then pass it on to whoever.
Thanks, Dr. Saab. So Nihal, Imam Nihal Khan, maybe, he's a young man, mashallah, trained in Nadwa and Hartford Seminary.
I see.
He's going to be teaching us a fall course, inshallah, at the MCGP, the Muslim Center, on poetry of Iqbal. So without further ado, Nihal, if you want to speak a few words, and then start, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. First and foremost, with a lot of you that are in attendance, I know for a fact that I'm probably the least qualified amongst many of you to be leading something like this. Hence my my plan during the time that we are here. And I originally had asked Sajid, I was like, are we doing this in like actual Urdu, or are we just going to be reading the poetry? And Sajid Bhai said that obviously, because there are people that that don't necessarily speak Urdu, we can definitely go over the verses of poetry and the lines that Allama Iqbal had written, and we can take it from there. I sometimes feel like I get pushed into circles like this for the only reason because of the fact that I lived in Lucknow for 3 years. And by living in Lucknow, everyone becomes a poet by definition. Whether you're, and for those that don't know, that are joining us and don't know the significance of the city of Lucknow, one could argue that it was basically the bedrock of Urdu for a very long time within the Indian subcontinent. And though within the changing landscape of the current Indian subcontinent, that aspect of it is, slowly being lost, unfortunately. During my time there, I noticed that a lot of people were, once upon a time, people don't know this, and this will kind of this will lay the foundation of what we're going to be talking about. But for those of you that don't know, until 1947, Persian was the oft-spoken language. Persian was what contracts were written in. And it was argued that India was home to more Persian literature than even Iran itself at one time. That actually, while I was there, I was studying at the Madrasa, Nadwatul Ulama, and I had a chance to, spend a little bit of time with some Urdu scholars there, some scholars of Islamic law. And there's literally a bedrock within Lucknow of, sure, English is on its way in, and then we're also dealing with like this excessive Hindiization of Urdu in India, but it's actually within the Urdu language in which there was this sense of unity, you could say, was found within Muslims over there, right? You had the Turks, you had the Persians, you had the Arabs, you had people from all different backgrounds coming together and uniting around the Urdu language, and it becoming and being a way for people to communicate in the subcontinent while also being much so rooted within their Islamic identity. So my plan is, during the few moments that we have over these few weeks, I'm going to be selecting different points of poetry from Allama Iqbal, and I'm going to be sharing it with you all and what it actually has to do with. So what I'm actually going to do is, for those of you that have ever, run through Allama Iqbal's poetry, or you wanted to learn it in English, there's one website which I'm going to pull up. It's like a blog spot. So for those of you that kind of have a visual aid to follow along, you could do that. But I will say this, and I think anyone who has studied language in any way, shape, or form whatsoever, we usually dread translations, right? When we see translations, they are an eyesore because of the fact that it just doesn't do justice to the poetry at hand. And during my own time studying like Arabic and stuff, during my madrasa years, when we see Quran translations, we actually have the same exact feeling. We're like, oh my God, this is so reductionist, right? So when you are given a reductionist worldview, it actually can lead to a form of violence, right? And that's not necessarily a form of violence that is physical, but that form of violence could be not doing justice to the text, may not be doing justice to what the author had intended, may not be doing justice to the meanings that the author tried to convey. And literature is filled with that, right? The challenge of literature, the challenge of poetry is that one is able to kind of take a step forward and understand how should they approach these ideas and bring them into fruition. And there was actually, before I get into that, obviously this is being held by the Muslim Center of Greater Princeton. A lot of folks are also very much so unfamiliar with the Quranic dialogue that occurs about poetry. So many of us may say that, oh, there's a lot of rhyming in the Quran, or there's a lot of poetry in the Quran. But what's interesting to note is that the Quran has often used poetry in a way which it has always used it very sparingly, right? So for example, in the Quran, I'm trying to bring up this verse in Surah Al-Shu'ara. In Surah Al-Shu'ara, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually speaks about poetry, right? And actually the entire Surah Al-Shu'ara, I'm actually going to share it with you all. I'm just going to open it up from here. Let's see. Right, Surah Al-Shu'ara, it's a really interesting surah, but if you actually go to the end of it, there's a really interesting section on it, which many of you may or may not know about. So in verse number 224, and I'm going to see if I can bring this up. So there is this verse, right? وَالشُّعَرَاءُ يَتَّبِعُهُمُ الْغَاوُونَ. And the poets only follow that which is deviating, right? Or only those who are deviated follow them. But there's actually a premise given as to what type of poetry is actually good, right? And you see that today for what is passed off as poetry in 2020 America. More often than not, you do have people differentiating between like music and poetry, but the more commonly consumed form of poetry has become music, right? And more often than not, it is reduced into very shallow understandings of meanings, which you can't really take a lot out of. But what was interesting is the Quranic perspective to poetry was that there is a standard set that most of what you're going to find is actually nonsense. Most of what you're going to find is someone speaking about their own pain, right? Which is maybe singular to them, but may not be universal to everyone else. But then verse number 225 is, Alam tara annahum fi kulli wadin yahimun, that you see them that sometimes their subject matter is all over the place. Wa annahum yaquluna ma la yaf'alun, and they say things which they don't do. So it's literally talking about verse number 225, how a lot of like the majority of poetry you're going to find, it's all over the place, right? I remember when we were studying forms of Arabic poetry, there were certain authors we studied only for the purpose of the words that they used, but their subject matter was all over the place and was irrelevant. But then it's qualified at the end by verse number 227, which says that those poets who call to belief, they call into values, they call people to actually have a belief in something, and they call people to do good deeds and remember God. Those are the poets that one should follow. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a purely religious form of poetry, but it's calling to something good. It's calling to something wholesome. So that's the most interesting point about the poets within the Islamic perspective. And for those of you that may or may not know about Allama Iqbal's poetry, we're actually going to go through portions of it, and the portion that I wanted to inshallah go through with you all is one about the oneness of God, which is the idea of Tawheed. So my purpose today is to mainly go over this, and hopefully we can gain from it, and we can understand how to be a bit more, how basically we can approach poetry, and also get an understanding as to Allama Iqbal and what his work was. I'm just trying to share this screen. 1 second. This is going to work with me. Okay. And not only that, I'm just trying to see from within the crowd how many folks there are. Okay. So I'm looking, there's obviously a lot of South Asian folks, but I'm going to quickly do a brief, I don't want to say an introduction, but many people are really unfamiliar with Allama Iqbal's background, right? I think many folks are unaware of the type of good that he had brought, the work that he had done. And I think it's important that people begin to understand and see what his life actually consisted of. Because number one, he's often credited credited merely as a poet, but it would be more wholesome and better to understand him in the context, obviously, of an India that was under colonization, right? An India that was colonized by the British, but also understanding his intellectual thought requires knowing what he did and where he studied and whatnot. And what's interesting is if you understand Islamic intelligentsia in the subcontinent, if you understand Islamic intelligentsia within what is now modern day India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, you do know, like, you have different groups, right? You'll have like, this Deoband school formed, or the Aligarh school formed, or the Nadwa school formed. And there was a lot of sectarianism. So you'll hear terms like so-and-so was Salafi or Ahle Hadith, or someone was followed a more traditional Sufi path, or you'll hear that someone was more Jamaat-e-Islami and wanted to be involved in politics and stuff like that. But what's interesting is that regardless of all of those scenarios, everyone found a common link with Allama Iqbal. Everyone found a common link with his thought. Everyone found a common link with his teachings. And even regardless of the fact when Pakistan was formed, obviously Allama Iqbal passed away before Pakistan was formed. And, it's just interesting to note that during that time period, people still found meaning in a lot of his work. And though much of his poetry revolves around Muslim identity, it revolves around understanding who you are and your cultural and your religious traditions, it's interesting to note that Allama Iqbal did not just study in some madrasa, or he didn't study in some, some university in India during that time, but he had studied in Cambridge, right? He had a degree from the University of Cambridge in England. He had a degree from the University of Munich. He has PhD from there in Germany. So when he came back, he was not just a poet, he was a philosopher putting his philosophy into poetry. That's what it comes down to. And he recognized that it was a means to convey ideas, right? It's a means to convey ideas and to bring people together and get them to understand what exactly is it that people need to do to understand who they are. And that is what is going to happen. So I wanted to go ahead and talk and just kind of give you all a synopsis of that. And not only that, and what's interesting, and a lot of folks don't know this, in the study of Islamic law, Allama Iqbal, though not very much so in depth, but there are actually discussions wherein, I think there was that English book, The Reconstruction of Modern Thought, according to, I think, Allama Iqbal it was called, or something. I can't remember the Urdu title of it. But
Islamic thought.
Yeah, The Reconstruction of Islamic Thought, yes.
Right.
So one aspect of a book like that was his discussion on like the idea of ijtihad, right? How should one do ijtihad? And we know that even in his, one of the books that we're going to be looking at is Zarb Kalim. In one of those books, he goes over the idea of ijtihad. So discussions like that are kind of toyed with within discussions of Islamic law. So I wanted to, inshallah, just kind of go ahead and we'll read some lines of poetry here. And actually here, to make it more interactive, instead of me reading it, we can have one of the participants read it. I think that would be helpful.
Excellent idea, Nihal. Great point. What I'd like to say is a few people are putting in the chat box and somebody, I think, I'm sorry, somebody just mentioned Zija Ali would like to make an introduction. So please, Zija, please, you can chime in now.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Thanks.
No, as the brother was speaking about who Allama Iqbal is, I just wanted to share very shortly something that I share with all people who admire and love Allama Marhum. Somebody shared this with me. He was Hakimul Ummat. He was Shair-e Mashriq. He was Musawwir-e Pakistan. He was Mufakkir-e Pakistan. He was Muhsin-e Pakistan. He was Qalandar-e Lahori. He was Ashiq-e Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was a doctor. He was Sir. He was Allama Muhammad Iqbal. So in very few short words, the breadth and depth of who Allama Iqbal was, and I just wanted to share that with the group.
So can you do me a favor? Can I ask you for one more point? Would you mind kind of expounding on that? in translated terms, because we do have a few people who may not be fluent in the English language. So I know some of them, like Allama al-Mashriq. Do you mind if you give us some short translations of that as well?
Sure. So Hakimul Ummat is a title that is given to our scholars by the Ummah, as Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanwi was given the title of Hakimul Ummat. It basically means somebody who has, Hakim is a doctor. That would be the coarse translation, but somebody who has the cure for what ails humanity, for what ails people. Shair Mashriq is the poet of the East. Mashriq is East, so Shair is a poet. So his most famous designation was poet of the East. Musawwir Pakistan means somebody who sketched the idea of Pakistan. Mufakkir Pakistan is somebody who was concerned with and thought about the idea of Pakistan. And Mohsin Pakistan, a friend, a benefactor of Pakistan. As people know, he was the one who dreamed of the idea of Pakistan, and then he is the one who tapped Qaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah to lead the political aspect, because Allama knew that he was not a political person or a statesman. He was the visionary, he was the guide. Qalandar-e Lahori, this is one that cannot be translated. Basically what the title here refers to is Allama Marhum was a dervish, was a saint, was a mystic. All of those combined. Maybe one of the other gentlemen can.
Yeah, Qalandar would mean somebody who is totally reliant and dependent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's karam. So he knows that it will come to him. He is totally oblivious to the worldly needs and depend on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only. That would be a Qalandar. That is the ultimate of being a moment.
That is such a wonderful correction, or not an addition to what I
just an expansion of that same idea.
Yes, because when people translate Qalandar, as the brother mentioned in translation, so much is lost. We get it in Urdu when somebody says Qalandar, the reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but when we say mystic or saint, that is lost. So that is a wonderful expansion.
Yeah. And the other thing, people think of Qalandar as somebody that they see on the street that maybe somebody that looks like a have-not, but that's not the case. Qalandar is really, it could be a well-dressed person also, that really is reliant on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and will reject anything and everything that comes in his way that takes him away from the remembrance of Allah.
Absolutely. The next one was Ashtiq Rasul. That is basically a lover of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and doctor, because he had a doctorate. Allama Marhum straddled the academic fields in both the Eastern as well as the Western tradition. He received a doctorate in metaphysics from Germany. Sir, because he was knighted for his accomplishments, and Allama is the title, and Alim, a scholar. So just a very rough translation, and I would appreciate it if some of the other gentlemen, if I didn't do justice to the translation of Hakimul Ummah or Musawwir Pakistan or anything else, if they could chime in.
You did that beautifully. Hakim is somebody who has the cure, and that's what he does. And Allama is somebody who's established and recognized master in that field. In this particular case, it would be the Islamic literature and Urdu literature. So he and Doctor of Philosophy was his degree. That's why he was called doctor, not a physician, but a doctor. Yes.
Thank you very much.
That comes to the idea of wisdom, and we know that wisdom is something that cures, because pure knowledge, rote knowledge without wisdom is not helpful, right?
That's right.
Wisdom is what helps us understand where knowledge goes. You can use brute force as much as you want, but if you don't know how to utilize that force, then it's just, it's not helpful.
That knowledge plus hikmah becomes Allama, yes, and Hakim, yes.
That's that. Would anyone else have anything else to add or contribute or ask?
Well, the one aspect, I think, if we take the aspect of Ashiq-e Rasul, would be that he actually had some spiritual and mystic dimension that has not been well described or mentioned in the literature. Only those that are specially involved in that kind of spirituality would know about that aspect of Iqbal. This may be a little bit beyond the scope of the discussion that we are having today, but suffice it to say that there is an aspect of Iqbal that is a little bit supernatural, so to speak, and that has to be somehow or the other discussed in some of his poetry, because he does claim in certain verses that he had that kind of a background to him. Yes.
Nice, nice. Okay, so I'm gonna see who would like to read these first two lines of poetry. I think we're gonna end up spending a decent amount of time. Actually, let's do the first 4 lines. Actually,
Okay.
So I have one person do the first 2 lines and then another person do the other 2 lines, inshallah.
I would recommend Dr. Abdul Rahman to speak it off.
Okay, the first one you gave the title of Tawheed. Zinda quwwat thi jahan mein, yahi tawheed kabhi. Aaj kya hai? Faqat ek masala-e ilm kalam.
Yeah. Yep.
Should I stop here? Should I do the other one?
Go for 2 more, inshallah.
रोशन इस जाओ से अगर जुल्मत किरदार न हो, खुद मुसलमान से है पोशीदा मुसलमान का मकाम.
Yeah. Yeah.
Should I translate that in Urdu also, or you want to go with that in English?
I think let's do this. Let's I'm gonna just go over a couple of words from here and then just get everyone's attention on this. But the 2 things that I want everyone to focus on are, number 1 is the word Tawheed in the first line, right? And Tawheed refers to the oneness of Allah, right? That's the main thing. And actually, there's something really cool I think I can do. I have my iPad open and there's some notes that I wanted to actually open up here. Yes, iPad. Share. Upload is required. Understand. Okay. All right. Screen. Okay, wonderful. Can everyone see this?
Yeah.
So the 2 words that I want everyone to focus on are here. Number 1 is Tawheed, and number 2 is Ilm Kalam, right? And these 2 words, right? We all know about Tawheed, right? Tawheed often refers to the oneness of God, right? That's the main subject of the first line. The second line has the term Ilm Kalam, which we're going to go over, which in Arabic is known as Ilm al-Kalam. And Ilm al-Kalam, I'm going to call it dialectics. Okay. Now, roughly, does anyone know around what time period this was written?
This should be between 1910 to 1920.
1910 to 1920, so roughly 100 years ago.
Yeah. When he came back from England,
yeah,
he did not get to do Urdu poetry until 14 or so, but in between he did have few verses in Urdu.
Yeah.
Basically, the original Kalam was in Farsi when he came back from England. So it has to be somewhere there, but it could be even later.
Yeah. The thing that I wanted to actually talk about is Zinda quwwat thi jahan mein yahi tawheed kabhi, right? Aaj kya hai faqat ek masala ilm kalam. Tawheed, he's talking about this idea of God's oneness, right? And this is something that I'm going to probably go off on a tangent a little bit. But when you see people talking about God's oneness today, it's become wrapped up in so many different isms, so many different ideas, so much of history. And though that has its place, the purpose of Tawheed, what Allama Iqbal is teaching us, is not just to have it as a talking point, as a philosophical or a theological talking point. And the reason I ask as to what year this was written roughly, it was roughly 100 years ago. And I want you to think about this now. You know, sometimes you go to a masjid, right? And the imam or someone is giving a khutbah or a class, and they're so focused on like these different groups, right? Oh, like I had mentioned, the Salafis this, and the Sufis this, and the Hanafis this, and the Shafi'is this, or the Jamaat Islami this, and the Tablighis this. But this idea of God's oneness, more often than not, is lost in all of these discussions. Now, what does that have to do with the second part? Aaj kya hai faqat ek mas'ala ilm kalam. Ilm al-kalam actually historically is the discussion of how can one rationally prove God? How can one utilize one's mind to understand and prove God's presence? And it brought me to reflect on something. There was this, because think about it, you have all these like history departments and theology departments and religious departments, which, yes, it's important that we have a trajectory of education to teach people history, to teach people philosophy. But if somebody is teaching things which they do not necessarily believe, or the fact that, you know, what Allama Iqbal is teaching is that you should have some sense of identity in God's oneness, and you cease to have that, you've lost the complete essence of what it means to be a Muslim, right? You've lost the essence of how one should approach their tradition. So he's saying here, this idea, this tradition of Tawheed, and he's going to get into it in the next two lines as to what exactly, you know, he means by Tawheed, that, you know, when we understand this idea of the oneness of God, he's going to say in the next line that it's something that should change you. It's something that should cause a yearning and a burning inside of you. And if it's not doing that, and you have been involved in a sense of reductionism, and you become very reductionist, and you say that it's nothing more than a few talking points, then it's going to be an issue. You know, to jump just a little bit, you know, I obviously work in the community, right? I'm constantly talking to people. I work as a, you know, director of religious affairs, and I work as a hospital chaplain. And you have a lot of young people who are falling into this exact paradigm, and it's actually leading them outside of Islam. It's leading them away from Islam. It's leading them to disbelieve in Islam, because Tawheed is being taught as nothing more than a talking point, than a philosophical point to just kind of prove or understand, but it doesn't actually have any meaning, right? Or you have people that are writing books upon books upon books about Tawheed that have nothing to do with how a person can be a better person. And I want to ask you this, right? When we are teaching the concept of God's oneness to our children, to our young people, is it a concept that we are teaching that is leading them to have a transformative experience of their faith? Or is it just being taught as a, you know, as a talking point and as a philosophical point that has no benefit to them, right? It's being turned into ilm kalam, right? It's knowledge of dialectics, knowledge of how to prove God. You know, there's this really interesting quote by Fakhruddin al-Razi, and he was someone that was very much so involved in trying to prove God. Yeah, and it's interesting, like the science of ilm al-kalam. You know, many of you are familiar with Imam Ghazali, right? Like we've heard of Ghazali, we've heard Allama Iqbal talk about Ghazali, right? Right? So
falsafa reh gaya talqeen Ghazali.
Yeah, so talqeen Ghazali, right? For about falsafa. So Allama Iqbal even speaks about him. But if you actually read people like Ghazali, they spent their entire life trying to reason as to why God exists, trying to reason how one can be a spiritually better person. And towards the end of his life, he goes, yeah, I wasted a lot of time doing that. Just believe in God and find a way to establish a connection with God. But, you know, this idea of ilm al-kalam, Fakhruddin al-Razi, he came into the city and people asked, who is this person that's coming into the city? And they're like, this is, and an old woman asked this, right? They said that this is somebody who has written a book called The 1,000 Proofs of God, right? Or like there's 1,000 proofs of God. She goes, and she basically remarks, he goes, oh, he must have had 1,000 doubts about God if he had to write a book about the 1,000 proofs of God. So it was interesting how that was kind of showcased, and how more than 100 years later, we are more in need of understanding this idea of seeing that that people need to kind of get out of this idea of just talking about God's oneness in a purely philosophical, in a purely theological idea. And actually going back to the tradition of what Tawheed actually was. Tawheed was supposed to be something that took the Sahaba, right, and made them people who were drunkards, people who committed zina, into making them into people who are the most beloved to God, the most beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And that's the transformative nature of what Tawheed was supposed to have been. But let's go ahead and talk about this, the second part. Roshan is zo se agar zulmat kirdar na ho, khud Musalman se hai poshida Musalman ka maqam. Roshan is zo se, right? This is an idea of what Roshan is to become enlightened, and zo is interesting, right? Or in Arabic, as it's called, it's low, right? And I'm going to bring in some Arabic here as well, because it helps you really understand, because we know that a lot of these words are Persian and they're Arabic, right? So it's interesting to understand the roots of these words. So with the word lo or zo in the Quran, it's really interesting. And I'm actually going to pull this verse up and to show it to you to understand the words of it really interestingly, right? So it's going to be in the 10th surah, Surah Yunus. And the reason I'm pulling this up, I don't want to make this into like a Quranic discussion, but like you just get a better understanding of the words when you see it in the original language that it had come from. So I'm going to stop the share here, share the screen over here. So in this surah, in surah number 10, in verse number 5, Allah says, Huwa alladhi ja'ala shams. Now I don't want you to get too confused. You have the word shams. Shams is the sun. And here in the translation, it is he who made the sun, okay, shams, a shining light, okay? Liya comes from the same word. Zo comes from ziya. You see it, you see liya here in Arabic, the word would be ziya, right? You know that word. So Allah is actually likening the sun to have liya or ziya. And he's calling wal qamar, the moon, is a nur. Nur, we often translate it as light, but here in the translation, it actually did a decent job in this respect, right? In the translation, Allah is saying, or rather in the translation, the person put it perfectly. Bo is actually a light source, right? Nur is a secondary source. So we know this for a fact, right? For those of you that study just a little bit of science, when you see the moon at night, is the moon sourcing its light from itself? Yes or no?
No.
No, it's not. It's taking it from the sun, right?
Yes. And
so scientifically, that's known that the light we see from the moon is actually coming from the sun. Versus here, Allah is actually calling the shams a source to light, like the first light, the original light, and calling the moon a secondary light. Now, you see what I'm saying here, right? So even the Quran has made this distinction. So when we actually go back to this, just once again pull up the iPad. Okay, so when we go back to this, Allah is using the word zo here as well, meaning what? It's the first light. It's not a nur. He could have said Roshan is nur se, right? But he didn't say Roshan is nur se. He said Roshan is zo se, meaning what? That the introductory, the essential light, the essential way of enlightenment, right? Roshan karna, kisi cheez ko roshan karna, it's what? It's shedding light on it, to enlighten, right? So we know the aspect of enlightening is in here, right? So enlightening through a primary source, right? That's the main point. Roshan is zo se, agar zulmat kirdar na ho, right? What does the is going back to? Roshan by this light, right? The light of Tawheed, right? The light of Tawheed is what is supposed to bring into a sense of what? Agar zulmat kirdar na ho. If someone's character is like, zulma is darkness, it can also refer to a sense of oppression in Arabic. But if somebody is lacking character, lacking a sense of self, right? Lacking a sense of khudi, as we'll see in parts of Allama Iqbal's poetry, then it's this light of Tawheed that is supposed to give your essence a sense of enlightenment, right? Not from secondary sources. Ilm al-Kalam is a secondary source. Theology is a secondary source. All these ologies and isms, if Tawheed is not causing us to become better people, then we're missing the point. रोशन इस दौर से अगर जुल्मत किरदार ना हो, खुद मुसलमान से है पोशीदा मुसलमान का मकाम. Sorry, खुद मुसलमान से है पोशीदा मुसलमान का मकाम. That from a Muslim, for one who does not recognize the essence of God's oneness, they will find themselves in a state where they will be poshida, right? They will be covered. They will not know what exactly their position is and who they are. And this is really important because we're going to see that in light of British colonization and in light of the colonization of European colonization as well, right? Because we know it wasn't the Brits that only colonized India. India was originally colonized in 1496 by Vasco da Gama from the Portuguese. We had the French come to Pondicherry. And yes, the British were the main colonizers. But Allama Iqbal is constantly calling on Muslims to not have a sense of cultural and religious amnesia, to kind of wake up, right? To understand that you have a sense of identity, you have a sense of being. And that sense of identity and being is rooted in knowing what your beliefs are and where and from whom you came from, right? And we're going to see a lot of that engulfed in Allama Iqbal's poetry. Khud Musalman se hai poshida Musalman ka maqam. So you cannot know where you stand if you don't know where you came from. And as a community worker, I'll say, and I'll kind of end off on this point because we've been going for a little bit, and I'll just open up for comments, Q&A and whatnot. You know, you see a lot of young people and I can't speak from any other perspective except the United States because this is where I was born and raised. But a lot of young people have a sense of religious and cultural amnesia, very similar to what Allama Iqbal often speaks about in his own poetry, that people see themselves that a European hegemony of culture is better than like a South Asian culture, right? Or other ways of understanding faith are better in respect to understanding our faith as Muslims. And what's interesting as well, why it's important to understand that Allama Iqbal was educated in Germany. The Germans, the French, and the English were the three main groups of academic Orientalists that were literally preaching to the world what the West should, or what the East should be, right? And Orientalism is basically where the West gets is dictating what the East should be, how the East should be understood, and how the colonies that they had created should be seen and controlled. But we know from our tradition that we see this repeating over and over again, that if we don't give people a sense of identity and belonging through the text, through the culture, through the institutions that we have, then we're going to lose a lot of young people, you know, to ways of life which are in essence antithetical to our own. And though you're in America, you can choose what religion you want, you can choose what culture you want. Sure, your free will and choice has its place. But is that the most dynamic and is that the most truthful representation of who we are as a community, as Muslims, and the culture and traditions that we come from as rooted within our faith? The answer to that, I would say, is probably no. But we have to grow. We have to understand where we came from. And we see it's scary. It's so hectically scary that 100 years after these lines were written, we are still living in these days. We are still living with bringing our community together to not have a sense of an inferiority complex of understanding what their culture, tradition, and religion are. So that's what I have for you all today. You know, we went through 4 lines of poetry in 45 minutes. But nonetheless, alhamdulillah, thank you for providing this opportunity to me, and the floor is for anyone that would like to contribute, inshallah.
Can I just add a little bit? I have to be leaving in a couple of minutes to another meeting. Can you pull this down a little bit, come to the first line?
It's usually not like that.
Here you go. I would put a yellow color on Zinda Kuvat also and Masala also.
Yeah.
Okay, here the spirit of his message basically is that this is a dynamic power.
Yeah.
Believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yeah.
And the other is Masala. You see, you have, mashallah, done a tremendous job on explaining these verses, beautiful, and you have conveyed the mafhum and meaning and the message that Iqbal wanted us to know or hear. But basically, if you go further lines and you read the rest of Iqbal's messages, move it now, but I'm just saying what he was basically saying, and I will use another verse that is in Persian to explain all of this to you so that I can make my point. He says, Cheez dunya az khuda ghafil shudan, na kumasho nukrao fardan dozan. What is this worldliness? Is to be oblivious or be just away from the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not, worldliness is not that you're wearing good clothes and you like jewelry and silver and gold and all that, and that you love your family and other things in life. He says, remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala all the time is what being a mu'min or what believing in Tawheed is. So here, dynamic force is always remembering that there is one Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Rest of the mention that you made is all masalai ilme kalam. All that is just talking about verbiage and all that as to what it Tawheed means and all that. He says, forget all of that. Just remember it's the power within you. And then the light comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the spirit that within us, that you will talk about in terms of Khudi in future course lessons, I hope. That is the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala within all of us. And that is a dynamic power that is directly coming from him, not a reflected light that, like you mentioned, the comparison between moon and sun. And once Roshan is Zawse, from that light, if you brighten up your character, Zulmat-e-Kirdar is the character, the darkness of your character. If you brighten that up and you build all your character knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in charge, watching over everything, and he's in total control, then khud Musalman reha poshida Musalman ka maqam. Unless you do that, then your own status, you're not aware of it. You're oblivious to your own status in this world. So it's beautiful. And if you go on to the further lines, Qul huwallah means he is the only one. Even if hardship comes to you, then you always have to remember Qul huwallah, that he is the one that is doing all of this. He says, because all the ilmul kalam people, alims and all that, they do not realize or recognize the fact that that is the quvvat that has really been dynamic, that is really the power the Muslims should have. So yes, all that discussion about oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what it means and what it entails, all of that is in an intellectual talk that is coming from your aql, your danish, your intelligence, and this is totally irrelevant here because that does not give you power. Just like you beautifully said, power comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's light directly. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Yes.
By the way, for anyone that would also like to follow the English of it, I just sent the link right now, which I was using before. But yeah, I mean,
Nihal, with your permission, let me, at the opening you had mentioned about English translations and all that stuff. Let me just say this because this is really matter very close to my heart. English translations, especially those that are done in poetry or in verse, definitely cannot do justice because poet has his own limitations. Even in English, even if he knows everything as to what the spirit of the share is, finding a comparable English matching rhyme is very difficult. So they compromise on that. But more important than that, most of the translations are done by people that were not necessarily good Muslims or behaving or practicing Muslims, or even if you are a practicing Muslim and a scholar in Islam, if you happen to be a poet, then that adds to your ability to translate it properly. Otherwise, poetry obviously translation will always be deficient in conveying the message. And when you make it poetic translation and it's done by non-believers, non-Muslims, then obviously it loses its value. But I wouldn't throw it away. I think it's a starting point, and it's the job of me and you now to do the right translation in simple words so that people can at least know what this share means. And then after that, they can build on their own knowledge and they can go into the research and get the truth.
Yeah.
So that has to be said. We have to really create that literature that has proper translations done by people who really understand the message. Yes.
Are there any translations that you would recommend to somebody that doesn't know any Urdu?
None exists yet. We
Okay.
are in the process of creating, but inshallah it'll be done soon.
There is one on Shikwa and Jawab-e-Shikwa, Kushwant Singh, an Indian poet.
Khushwant Singh, yes, Sardarji.
Yes.
That
which actually does a justice more than I have seen, and he was able to do it in rhyme.
Yes.
For both just the Shikwa and Jawab-e-Shikwa. So if anybody is struggling with, is not a native Urdu speaker or is struggling with that, I would recommend Kushwant Singh's Shikwa and Jawab-e-Shikwa, and Abul Hasan Nadwi's The Glory of Iqbal. It is not that difficult a book to get, but Allama Nadwi wrote a book on the glory of Iqbal, and he translated many works of Allama in English.
So I think one thing is that I think for a lot of the books that were translated, actually, it's interesting. He himself actually did the translation, but they were written into Urdu by him. And then there's this institute, because he died actually in 98, and he was not well versed in English, but he actually had commissioned it to an organization in England, which I actually still have. Oh yeah, right here. So the organization, the UK Islamic Academy. So you still have a lot of Abul Hasan Nadwi's books done by him into. They do a spectacular job of the Urdu into English, because his Arabic, number one, he used to write in Arabic. It was just like, when we used to study his work at Nadwa, and it was very difficult. So like during exam time, we would try to get like the Urdu translations of his Arabic, because his Arabic was more difficult than his Urdu. But that's what it was. But yeah, so anyone else, Dr. Minai, I would definitely love to hear from you.
Assalamu alaikum, bahut shukriya, thanks a lot. And Nihal bhai, I learned a lot from you on this topic on Iqbal and in general. Thanks a lot for this talk to everyone and everyone who arranged it as well. I was making several points and notes as I was going along. I won't go through all of them, but just on the last query about there being what are the good translations. So I would recommend not a whole long translation, but several pieces that have been translated by Professor Frances Pritchett of Columbia University. And she has a website, her homepage, and it's a wonderful resource for all of South Asia, everyone who's interested in South Asia, but specifically for Urdu and for Hindi as well. And there's tons and tons of material. The website is searchable. If you type in Iqbal, then she has taught entire courses on him as well, and she has done a lot of translations herself. The specific reason I would recommend her translation is actually in juxtaposition to what Abdurrahman Bhai was saying. Frances Pritchett is not a Muslim herself, but I wouldn't call her an unbeliever because she is very, very close to Iqbal. Plus her translation strategy is very particular in the sense that she reads up on the history and the philosophy of the poet that she is going to attempt to translate, and then does her best. Plus she then consults with native speakers and scholars. She provides almost all of the different permutations and shades of meaning of each word as well. There's a pro and con to that strategy. The pro is that, yes, you get a very, very comprehensive, of course, you can't have a completely comprehensive picture, but you get a much more comprehensive picture of the different possibilities of the poetry. The con, unfortunately, is that then the translation is not very flowing, and it is not very aesthetically pleasing. For instance, she will sacrifice rhyme for the sake of giving you the different possibilities, etc. Then she will also quote interpretations from 4 or 5 different sources as well. And most of those sources would be from native speakers or people who happen to be Muslims as well. Then there are several very interesting, very beneficial translations from other non-Muslims as well. A lot of our Hindu and Christian brethren have attempted these translations. I'm deliberately using the word interesting instead of good, because I agree completely with Abdurrahman Bhai, or I should say Chacha, because he is
Bhai.
Ji Bhai, that yes, it is well nigh impossible to give the exact sense that of the original. But that has its own charm as well. It opens up, we can look at it as precluding the possibility of what the poet intended, but we can see it as opening up the doors of a lot of other shades of meaning and interpretations of the same poetry as well. But one specific recommendation I would say for what would be for Francis Pritchett, I'll end on this point, that if people are interested, especially in Ghalib and Mir, I would especially recommend her website as well, because she has undertaken the mammoth task of putting all of the corpus of Ghalib and Mir online, writing out each couplet in Urdu script, Nagri script, and Roman English script, with translation and interpretations from, or sharahs or explanations from 4 or 5 different sources. So she is quite, it's quite a comprehensive, and she provides links to other places as well. So I have many other things that I can talk about, but I'll suffice.
Is Sajid still on?
On, I was just muted. I'm on.
Okay, go ahead. Do you know any other translation of Shikwa Jawab-e-Shikwa?
No, my knowledge of this is very poor. I'm just the facilitator, Doctor.
Okay, you do have that knowledge, because I gave you that book, Shikwa Jawab-e-Shikwa, that I wrote.
I know,
but 10 years ago. By the way, in this translation that I did some time ago, I gave, I'm sorry, I don't have the proper, I actually gave the Urdu on one side, and then underneath I gave Logat, all the difficult words in that particular misra, and then underneath I gave a Rawan Tarjuma, flowing translation in Urdu, simple translation, and then under that I gave Mafhum. So there are 4 different topics that I used so that people would really get exactly the gist of it. On the opposite side, I wrote it in English transliteration. Underneath I gave the simple English translation, and underneath I wrote the message. This was done a few years ago, and I published it not too long ago, but I did that in 2010, which was exactly 100 years after Iqbal wrote it. Shikwa came out in 1910, and 100 years later, I had written another poetry of my own in which it was called Faryada and Appeal. I said, 100 years ago, somebody complained, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I'm submitting a appeal to that, and I want to see what action has been taken on that. At that time, I translated Shikwa and Jawab-e-Shikwa, simple, but I'm,
Dad, I have it here.
Yeah. You have it?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm showing it on the video.
Oh, good. So I mean, this is available to you people. I'll probably give it to Sajid more copies so we can,
So Dr. Saab, Sarah Sayed is asking, where can we get a copy of your translation? So,
I will give it to Amir, who lives next to you. So he'll bring it to Princeton Masjid, and from there you can probably.
And Amir, if you can just type in the chat room where somebody can purchase it, or
Absolutely. I'll provide my contact information and they can.
Amir is the source of this, because when he was at Harvard, he used to come for weekends and he would say, well, let's have a lesson from Iqbal. and I will pick any verse from his kulliyat, and I will translate it for him. And that gave me the idea that this is needed in universities and colleges here. So let's make it available to these children. So anybody that doesn't know Urdu at all can still benefit from this. But I only have done Shikwa and Jawab-e-Shikwa. Now I have done a few more poems in the same format, and that book is coming pretty soon.
And may I recommend a platform on which Abdurrahman Bhai, if you agree, can put it on. It will inshallah get to thousands and thousands of people. You might be familiar with an organization called Rikhta.
Of course.
.org.
Yeah,
Right.
Rekhta is fairly basic.
Rekhta.
Rekhta has a tremendous source. But the need of children here basically is what we are doing now, what Nihal has started and all, making it really easy so that they can understand it. And once they develop interest, then they can go into further resources and research.
Right.
So,
I'm recommending Rekhta especially because when I teach, all my students are very young, and the feedback that I get from them as to what kind of platforms and sources they're comfortable with, and that they go to for Urdu, then Rekhta always seems to be the most popular one. And one reason is that Rekhta is able to publish everything in 3 different scripts. So even the large community that I get in my classes are actually Muslims from India who are not necessarily familiar with the Nastaliq script. Or actually a lot of people who are not Muslims or from India and are Urdu lovers.
Yes.
And they are able to then read, they'll be able to read your book in Nagari script, in Roman script, whatever is comfortable.
Their script,
And
yeah.
I would really my students would really benefit from your book as well then.
Well, it inshallah will be provided to Sajid Bhai, and then at least this group can use that, and then we'll create more works like that. I had you in mind without even meeting you, that when you recommend something to your students, they should be able to read it and they should be able to connect with it. And I did not put in Devanagari or other. I thought that just putting English and Roman English should probably be good for those children that at least are exposed to spoken Hindi or Urdu.
Right.
And Rekhta, of course, is good for me and you, those who have some basic information and knowledge, so they know what to look for. But the ones that are starting here, like Amir, like my son, for them, a basic approach is important. If I could do that for Rumi, Iqbal, Amir Minai, Ghalib, that would be a tremendous service. And if the book is just 200 pages for each of them, then that would really be, sufficient for them to build a base when they are in undergrad and our universities. They take optional as Urdu and then build on it. So that is the syllabus that we are working on now. And I'll be talking to you then. If you're in Princeton, maybe we should meet up one day. And I should see what your students need. And God, whatever time He has given us, here, the advantage that I feel I have, which which many people do not have, is that I am a poet. I know the nuances of poetry. And you want to say something, I can easily say that in poetry than giving a talk in Nasr. So it's easy, and we should do that.
So I think we're kind of wrapped up with our time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, should we wrap up? Any last words or any parting words?
This was fun. I enjoyed this.
Likewise, like I said, my knowledge is very poor in this. I'm just.
You're an honorary Lucknowi. We met in Lucknow.
Yes, my wife is from Lucknow. So
actually, a lot of people don't know that me and Sajid actually met for the first time in Lucknow.
You know what Iqbal says about Lucknow?
He says a lot about Lucknow.
Iqbal Lucknow se na Delhi se hai gharaz. Hum to asir hain khame zulfe kamal ke. Kham is the twist, zulf is the hairlock, kamal is excellence. He says, wherever I find excellence, I am victim. I get captivated by that. I don't have any connection with Lucknow or Delhi, he says, and I don't care. Iqbal says, for me, it's the Hame Zulfe Kamal. Excellence, wherever it is, I catch that. So sitting in Lahore and Sialkot, basically he says that regardless of where I am, or sehet zaban meri kaisi bhi hai, I really like excellence. And you made the point earlier on that he was not proud to be a poet. He was proud to be a person with a message and conveying that message. And he did that very well through the medium of poetry.
Right.
And you remind me of what's his name, Mirza Hadi Ruswa. He said, "Delhi chuti thi, पहले अब लखनऊ भी छोड़ दें, दो शहर थे ये अपने दोनों तबाह निकले."
Yeah. So we have to just go wherever the excellence is. And quite frankly, now the future, the way I see for Urdu, is not necessarily in India or Pakistan. It's probably here in North America, believe it or not. The research work that is being done here, original work that is being done here by scholars like Taqi Abadi, is not found anywhere now elsewhere. So,
and may I just leave on one small teaching point that I use in my classes to attract students to Iqbal, because it's something that came up with that Nihal Bhai mentioned very astutely about Tawheed. So when I, in the classroom, I explain Tawheed as the unity of God, and when I use the term oneness as well, the students really get, the more intellectually curious ones actually ask me, okay, is there a shade of difference between oneness and unity? Are they kind of the same thing? Or are they just absolute synonyms? Can we just use either interchangeably?
Either or.
Right. But when I think about it and I explain that, okay, look, oneness can also, and Tawheed can be interpreted as the unity between everything as well. And that unifying force, that unifying reality, the haqiqah, is Allah, is God, right? Then that actually opens up a lot of room for Iqbal's universality then. And so the other day we were discussing Sufism and Iqbal's relationship, and the subject of Khaja Muinuddin Chishti came up, and he had said in a very simple but beautiful saying that sab khuda ke hain, मैं भी खुदा का हूं, तू भी खुदा का है, इसलिए तू भी मेरा है. Everyone is God's. I am God's as well, and you are God's as well. Therefore, mathematically speaking, you are mine as well. So the fundamental oneness and connection between people can be seen as a part of Tawheed as well. And when I expand the meaning of Tawheed from just being the belief in just one God without any other gods, it opens up a lot of room for Iqbal's universality as well.
The word that would make it easy for you would be yakta, one of a kind. If you say that, one of a kind, there was laisa ka mislihi shay, nothing like that exists. That would explain it much easier. It'll make it easy for you. You can't give an example because there is nothing like him. He is the only one. The saying one or unity or whatever else is confusing. But saying yakta, one of a kind, that differentiates it from everything else. Everything else is creation, and he's the creator.
By the way, there was a question about meeting up once COVID-19 subsides. Sajid, I can give more details on this, but I believe we'll be doing this session live in 2 weeks, if I'm correct, right?
That's right, on the 27th of Sunday. So we will be socially distant, of course. We can meet outside the masjid. We have a beautiful healing garden. Either we can meet there, weather permitting. Otherwise, we can go inside into a multi-purpose room. And it's a small group. We can sit 8 feet apart and have a discussion on site.
You're
And
increasing
we'll
it
be
from
live streaming that as well. So yes,
I'm sorry.
I said we're
Right.
going to be live streaming that as well, right?
Yes, that'll be a live sitting.
Yeah.
So
Very
that's on the 27th of September at 11:30 a.m. Inshallah.
Is there a
So
session next week?
there will be a session, Zoom session next week.
Okay.
Yep.
So every Sunday, every 3 weeks, it's a Zoom session. Actually, every week it's a Zoom session plus an on live session once a month. So those who can attend live would be great. Otherwise, you can join us by Zoom.
Will next week's session also be on Iqbal?
Yeah, we're going to be continuing with this. I'm just going to
We're just gonna
continue
for 2
with
weeks
this
and
until
then
we
we
come to the end of this of this, inshallah. Of the Tawheed section, inshallah.
So our plan, Mustafa, is to bring other poets in as well, obviously. And I know, mashallah, Mustafa is more on, his expertise is more on Ghalib. So, inshallah. Am I right?
Nahi, my expertise is just on literature itself, if I can call it expertise. But
Are
yes,
you a poet, Mustafa? Are you write poetry also?
I have worked on more than others. Sorry?
Are you a poet?
No, unfortunately,
Oh, okay.
I'm not.
I thought you were.
I write a little bit of poetry, but
Okay.
nowhere near your level of proficiency. And
No, not me, but I mean Amir Minai, yeah.
Gee, so I do write some poetry. Gee.
So I just wanted to add, share one thing as Brother Nihal Khan was relating, just those two verses. The following sprang to mind, which encapsulates so much of what Allama Marhum was about in terms of trying to wake up a generation that has fallen asleep. Allama said, "Ghafil na ho khudi se kar apni pasbani, shayad kisi haram ka tu bhi hai astana. तेरी निगाह से दिल सीनों में कांपते थे, खोया गया है तेरा जज्बे कलंदराना. ऐ ला इला के वारिस बाकी नहीं है तुझ में, गुफ्तार दिल बराना, किरदार काहिराना."
Wow.
May Allah allow us, this is such a wonderful initiative. May Allah allow us to reflect on and internalize and act upon the message that Allama Marhum gave to an entire generation a century ago, and so many of his lovers and ashiq are still are in Princeton and Central Jersey, alhamdulillah, right now.
So I
Well
think we should
said.
wrap up.
Very well said.
Nihal, any other parting comments?
No, I think जो चीज बोलने की थी वो बोल दिया, और जब कलाम पूरा हो चुका होता है उससे जरूरत से ज्यादा बोलना तो मैं वो कबाहत महसूस हो जाती है. So
All right.
what I basically said was that often if what's been said has been said, then you shouldn't say more than what's necessary, or else it's deemed kind of ugly. As they say, right? Words are silver, silence is golden.
Inshallah, we'll meet up again next week then.
Inshallah.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Okay.
Allah Hafiz.
Can somebody make dua?
Yes, that'd be good. I was going to say that.
Sure. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah, Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala ali Muhammad, kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim, innaka hamidun majid. Allahumma barik ala Muhammadin wa ala ali Muhammad, kama barakta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim, innaka hamidun majid. اللهم إنا نسألك حبك وحب من يحبك وحب عمل يقربنا إلى حبك يا أرحم الراحمين. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Ameen.
Okay, everyone. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Inshallah, we'll meet up again.
Inshallah.